Hey guys, I'm Hop. Thanks for tuning in to TFBTV. I'm out at the range today with the new CMMG Dissent. This is an ultra-compact PDW AR available in 300 Blackout, 5.56, and 5.7. This is not the 5.7 version. This is 300 Blackout. There are quite a lot of ARs and PCCs on the market that are advertised as being PDWs, and most of them really aren't, mainly because they're just too big. The CMMG Dissent is actually properly small. This is a real PDW. We'll talk about what that means for a civilian buyer a little bit later, but for now, let's take a closer look at it. CMMG already has a compact AR platform called the Banshee. The difference between that and the Dissent is that the Banshee is still using a full-size AR bolt carrier group that needs to recoil into the buffer tube. The Dissent instead has a much shorter bolt carrier group, which gives it room for a pair of recoil springs that fit inside the upper receiver. It's not exactly a new idea, sort of similar to how the AR-180 works, and in the early 90s a company called Olympix Arms made a gun called the OA-93, which was very similar in concept. It was a bufferless AR pistol design. The Dissent also differs from the SIG MPX and MCX because it's not piston driven. This is still a direct gas impingement gun. There is a gas block and a gas tube under the handguard, and the charging handle just telescopes out over the top of the gas tube. The CMMG Dissent has a 6.5-inch barrel in all three caliber options. That's ridiculously short for a 5.56 barrel, and that version is probably more of a fun range toy than anything. Ultra-compact 5.56 guns are a laugh riot to shoot, but the blast doesn't justify the lack of terminal performance, and a lot of suppressors aren't rated for use on barrels shorter than 10 inches anyway. If you're trying to speedrun hearing loss, knock yourself out. The 300 Blackout and 5.7 versions of the Dissent are much cooler. 300 Blackout doesn't take as much of a performance hit from a short barrel, and even with the suppressor added, the overall length of the gun will still be super compact. The 5.7 version is interesting too. A 5.7 Dissent has a longer barrel than most 5.7 handguns, which is beneficial for a high-velocity cartridge like 5.7, and it uses CMMG's proprietary 32-round magazines for their AR conversion uppers. 32 rounds with next to zero recoil goes a long way to make up for the lack of terminal performance compared to the more proper 10-inch barrel length of an FNP90 or the Kel-Tec P50. Still, a lot of the appeal of 5.7 is lost no matter what your barrel length is if you can't get the proper ammo for it. And if you're a civilian, the proper ammo is going to be sold in tiny quantities for $10 a round on Gunbroker. So the 300 Blackout is the one worth talking about in my opinion. The philosophy of use behind the Dissent is very clear to me. This is a bag gun or civilian PDW. I have to make that distinction because a good military PDW isn't necessarily suited to civilian needs. For a PDW to make any sense for a civilian, it has to fit concealed inside a relatively inconspicuous bag without taking up the whole bag. If you put your PDW into a backpack and no longer have room for water, snacks, socks, and a jacket, it's not a bag gun. It's a regular gun in a gun bag. So all the fun stuff with this gun is happening in the upper receiver. It's a little bit taller than you would find on a mil-spec AR style upper. That's because this has to contain some additional components like action springs and stuff within the upper. That means that the lower is still just a standard AR lower. This is a regular CMMG AR lower, and instead of having a buffer tube and a castle nut on the back end, there is an end plate with a 1913 adapter you can use to attach pistol braces or stocks if you go the SBR route. The folding brace allows this thing to stow very compact. It ends up being extremely short overall, and because the brace is so thin, and because ARs themselves are pretty thin to begin with, this does not take up a whole bunch of space. If you wanted to be able to have a suppressor on here and still stow it more easily, you could throw a quick attach muzzle device on there and have a suppressor stored separately from the gun. It keeps this thing very, very compact indeed. For comparison, here is an approximately 5-inch barreled AR-9 pistol. It is not a folding design. It is ever so slightly thinner because there's nothing folding to the side and there's no side charging handle, but it is significantly longer, probably about 5 to 6 inches longer. So fitting one of these things into a bag, not so easy. If you put a law folder on here, you could get it a little bit shorter, but then you'd also be doubling the width and adding a lot of weight and probably ruining the reliability because AR-9s are not exactly resilient to modification. This has the SB Tactical FS1913 folding brace, which is not a terrible option. The best thing about it really is that it's affordable and it folds very flat. Unfortunately, I never find these to be particularly stable. There isn't a positive latching mechanism on the back, it's just friction. So it can very easily slide and unlock if you are shooting a more stout recoiling cartridge. For example, 300 Blackout. I haven't had that happen when I use an FS1913 on a Ruger Charger pistol. 22, very light recoiling. If you really try to control the recoil of something like a 9mm or a 300 Blackout, you will probably have the brace collapse on you. That's something that SB Tactical tried to address with revisions to this brace, but it hasn't seemed to work in my experience. The new ones fold just as often as the other ones. There are some other options for folding braces. I think AT3 Tactical, I want to say, and maybe if you got one of the Sig Sauer PCB braces, I believe those have a much more positive folding and unfolding mechanism. You actually have to deliberately push down a button to unlock the system. So that's probably something I would recommend more. If you do go the SBR route, your options are going to open up significantly. The Dissent is ultra short, and with a thin folding brace like the SB Tactical FS1913 or one of the options from AT3 Tactical, it's not too wide either. Something we can't say for an MP5, a CZ Scorpion, or any AR with a law folder. So the Dissent falls into the same category as something like a SIG MCX Rattler or a pistol caliber PDW, like one of the 20 or so nearly indistinguishable models from B&T. The option to shoot supersonic 300 Blackout ammunition gives you a lot more range and damage potential versus a 9mm PDW, and the Dissent is cheaper than an MCX. It's still pretty expensive though. MSRP on the Dissent is $2,000. CMMG definitely tried to make the Dissent worth that asking price. This is a smartly designed and well-made gun, and it's also packed with upgrades, most of them from the CMMG zeroed line of aftermarket parts. That name means basically nothing to me, and unfortunately I don't really like any of the upgrades. I would rather the gun was cheaper and more basic, to be honest. Don't mind the mess. This thing was sitting on the hood of my truck and then it slid off and landed in a puddle, so now it's very muddy. The short throw ambidextrous safety lever, for example, is very stiff and a little too low profile, and it has a weirdly aggressive texture that kind of chews up your finger. The mag release is ambidextrous and has an extended button on the right side of the gun, maybe a nice feature for lefties or people with very short fingers, but I don't have either of those deformities personally. I think they just make it easier to inadvertently drop your magazine when you don't mean to. The trigger on the Dissent is also way too good. It's a TriggerTech cassette-style 2-stage trigger that's very light and crisp. It's honestly a lot nicer than the triggers I put in my scoped ARs. But it's very out of place on this gun. A super compact PDW meant to be tossed in a bag and potentially employed under extreme duress probably shouldn't have a match-grade hair trigger in it. I would rather have a mil-spec AR trigger in this gun, but unfortunately CMMG disclaims on their website that not all AR-compatible triggers will necessarily work in the Dissent. That might just be typical CYA, but I'm not sure. The 300 Blackout version of the Dissent also comes with an SLR adjustable gas block, so you can tune the gun to run supers or subs, suppressed or unsuppressed. The 5.56 and 5.7 versions don't have an AGB, and they don't need it. I actually didn't need it either. I shot the Dissent suppressed and unsuppressed using a variety of bullet weights, and it functioned flawlessly without me having to touch the gas system. I could probably have tuned it to be softer shooting, but I didn't want to waste a bunch of ammo to test reliability. The factory muzzle device of the Dissent is basically a linear compensator, aka a flash hider that doesn't hide flash. It's mostly there to protect your delicate fingies from getting too close to the barrel, but there's also a finger stop machined into the bottom of the handguard to keep your hand from sliding forward, and it also gives you a nice index point. The 300 Blackout version of the Dissent is threaded 5/8x24 for typical 30 cal muzzle devices and suppressors. I didn't run a quick attach can, I just used my YHM Resonator K with a direct thread adapter. Between the short suppressor and short barrel, the gun wasn't all that quiet even with subsonics, but any form of 300 Blackout is way more pleasant to be around than 5.56 would be from the same barrel length. Shockingly, the Dissent didn't heat up too fast when shooting suppressed. The handguard is fairly beefy for an M-LOK design. The short length might make mounting accessories a bit difficult, but it does have M-LOK slots on the side and bottom and a full length of 1913 rail on the top. It's pretty easy to get a weapon light and tape switch on the gun and still have somewhere to hold it. I tried to go a little more aspirational with it. Here's how I ultimately got the Dissent set up. When you configure the Dissent, you want to make sure that you don't compromise the most important feature of it, which is that it folds very flat. So that means the brace is going to fold to the same side as the charging handle because that creates a pretty flat plane, keeps the other side very slick, makes it a lot easier to cram it into a bag. That poses a challenge when choosing a weapon light setup. You cannot mount a weapon light to the same side as the charging handle because it would get in the way. If you mount a weapon light to the opposite side and use a tape switch on top, then you've just made the gun significantly wider, it's going to sit funky in a bag, and it's going to snag on the draw. So we're looking for lights that can sit on top of the rail and be controlled from the body of the light itself. Basically that means pistol lights like the Streamlight TLR1, Surefire X300, perhaps the Inforce WML, at least the compact version might be short enough. This gun is set up with a Holosun LE321. This is a 4-function light and laser unit. It has a visible laser, a white light, an IR laser, and an IR illuminator, all controlled with the onboard fire button. This thing sacrifices a lot of performance to get a bunch of capability into a really small package. It's not a very powerful white light. It's a very, very weak IR illuminator, but it does have 4 functions in one very small package. Doesn't make the gun any wider, sits perfectly into the negative space that we already have given up by putting an optic on it. I'm not saying the Holosun LE321 is necessarily the best choice for the CMMG Dissent, but I think the Dissent might be the best choice for the LE321. Ponder that one for a minute.
Alright, let's put some kind of bow on this. The CMMG Dissent is a pretty awesome little package. There are cooler guns you can buy for $2,000, but most of them don't have such an appealing practical niche as this. If you're trying to get maximum effect from a PDW or bag gun, this is one of the relatively few ways to do it. You can put a lot of different guns in almost any size of bag, but shorter and thinner is always better. Just remember to put stuff in your get-home bag that can actually get you home, unless you figured out a way to purify water by using a 7.5-inch AR with a law folder.
Every time.
Alright, that's the show, guys. Thank you for watching. TFBTV is supported by our sponsors Ventura Munitions and Top Gun Supply. Go ahead and check them out. We're also supported by our viewers directly via Subscribestar and Utreon. Links to both of those are in the video description. You can also support us with YouTube memberships, but despite being a niche micro-internet celebrity, I don't actually know how those work yet. If you do support us via Subscribestar and Utreon, you'll be eligible for a bunch of giveaways that James puts together, and you can also watch a Q&A series that James and I have been doing, which is kind of fun. Alright, see you next time.